Let's now move into a different kind of injury that insects can produce in trees and shrubs, and that's to tunnel into the plant. So, various kinds of insects develop underneath the bark or within the plant. This first group I want to discuss are those that limit their attacks to just the terminal growth, the smaller diameter twigs, the ends of the plant. And various kinds of insects do this. Primarily, we see certain kinds of caterpillars, that some kind of larvae of some kind of moth or some kind of beetle. There's one group of flies that develop in the terminal growth pines. And then later, I want to talk about cicadas, which actually injure terminal growth, but do it in a very different way. They lay their eggs and splinter the bark of the twigs. We're talking about the insects that are feeding on terminal growth of pines. Many of them are what we call pine tip moths, a couple of different genera of pine tip moths. These are all caterpillars that develop from fairly small moths, moderate-sized moths, that lay their eggs on the developing growth of pines, and then the eggs hatch, and then the young go into the terminal. So often there'll be some little entry point where the caterpillar that hatched from the egg moves into the plant, and then they will feed within, girdling the twig where they're feeding and causing it to die back from that point. So the kind of injury you're going to see with the pine tip moth is that there's going to be a dead terminal, and were you to then break it at that point, you could see that the area at the base of where the injury occurs has been essentially reamed out by the feeding of some developing caterpillar. So there's either the caterpillar itself may be inside that bud or that terminal, or evidence that there has been feeding. Again, it's been excavated by the caterpillar. So what we'll see with the pine tip moth is sometimes a distortion if it's not completely killed, but we'll also see a change in the growth of the plant. If the terminals are killed, then side terminals become new dominant ones, and you get kind of a bushy growth, a little kind of change in the pattern of how the plant may grow. Often this is more of a cosmetic kind of injury, unless you're growing a plant for nursery or for forestry where you need a straight bole and straight limbs. But usually they're just feeding on a couple little terminals here, terminals there. Now, if we are going to go after tip moths for control, this is an insect that is exposed and capable of being controlled when it's on the outside of the tree. The period when larvae are exposed on the bark, when the adults have laid their eggs and the eggs are hatching, that's the most effective period when you may wish to treat for a pine tip moth. And for most of the pine tip moths, it usually occurs more or less when the plant is candling, it's producing the new shoots, and the needles have not yet formed. So that's generally the time when most tip moths will move to the pines, lay their eggs, and if we were to have a treatment in place at this point, then they can be effectively controlled. In areas where pinion's growing, it's a little bit different. There's actually two different kinds of tip moths on pinion that have a little bit different life history. Again, the same kind of symptoms you'll see, though, is the terminals are killed because there is some sort of developing larva that has girdled the area and excavated the tissues at the base of where you start to see that symptom. Some of them, if they come in a little earlier, they may take out a bud. And if that's killed, then they may subsequently move into a second terminal. And so you will see the larvae taking out sometimes more than one terminal, a single terminal from a single caterpillar. It'll pupate in there, a little picture of the pupa in the lower right. And that's the insect that's commonly known as the pinion tip moth. There is another one that's also on pinion called the pinion pitch nodule maker, where often there is a large, smooth ball of sap that develops at the feeding point, and the larva is within this. Both of them, again, affect just pinion, and they're life history is a little different from the other tip moths we see because they spend quite a bit of time on the outside of the plant before they go in. They may lay eggs in the summertime and winter on the bark and not move into the terminal until the next spring. So with the tip moths on pinion, the period when the larvae are exposed on the bark could be in mid to late summer, but they're also going to overwinter and then initiate tunneling the following spring, and they'll be overwintering on the outside of the plant. So spring applications can also work for this one. Systemic insecticides are often used for tip moths as well, but only systemic insecticides in the organophosphate class are effective. The neonicotinoids like imidacloprid are not effective on moths, the larvae of moths, so would not be an appropriate treatment. So pine tip moths on conifers are the primary kind of terminal feeding group of insects that you're going to see. There are some that are less commonly observed. There's a group of tiny little bark beetles known as twig beetles, and these are generally restricted to natural areas, but they will sometimes develop on pines, causing the terminal growth to die. Now, bark beetles, which we'll talk about quite a bit more in just a little bit, are going to have a distinctive kind of pattern underneath the bark that they make. The adult beetle will go in, it'll make a little cavity, lay eggs, and then the larvae will develop underneath the bark, creating a distinctive kind of pattern that would allow you to identify if twig beetles were present. The twig beetles are extremely tiny, very small beetles. You may also see exit holes, but that are produced when the adults emerge, but again, very small, thinner, smaller than a pinhead for almost all of these. And then just a curious group of flies that you may occasionally run into, and this is mostly in this part of the world on ponderosa pine, are pitch midges, which are a group of tiny little flies that develop in the twig growth of certain kinds of pines. So in these pictures here, you can see a couple of things. On the one on the left, not sure if you can see just some little kind of orange maggots, kind of at the tip. Also in the picture on the lower right, you can see the little orange maggots there, and the associated pitch at the feeding site. They excavate small little cavities in the terminal. There's usually a lot of ooze at the point. So there's the larvae right there, kind of reddish orange maggots develop in small cavities in the twig, and again, oozing often results from this. Fairly difficult to detect because these are so small and soft-bodied kind of larvae that may be easily broken or punctured as you try to poke around to see what you have. But they could be one of the symptoms that would be associated with a dying terminal. Certainly something to look for. Now, moving on to deciduous trees and shrubs, there are many moths and beetles that have larvae that tunnel the terminal growth, and they go by various names: shoot borers, or twig girdlers, or twig borers. Some of the more common ones are caterpillars, but also many beetles also will develop as twig borers too on deciduous trees. So here would be one that goes into the shoots of cottonwood. So what you might see in this case is the twig might be flagging, it might wilt and break. And if you look at the broken terminal, you could then see that it has been excavated internally by the caterpillar, or at least some insects. So these will show excavation kinds of injuries in the terminal growth that will allow you to determine that an insect borer, or shoot borer in this case, is the cause, rather than, say, a fungus disease that causes the tissues to collapse and fail to move nutrients. So there will be some clear evidence of excavation with a shoot borer. Another one on prunus is peach twig borer, a little tiny moth that might cause the tip growth of various kinds of prunus, including peaches, to die back. And again, if you look at the base of where the injury is showing, you'll see that it has been excavated out, and perhaps you'll find the insect itself that caused it. Earlier we talked about the bronze cane borer as a kind of insect that is associated with the caneberries, the raspberries, and the like. So that's one of the more common cane borers, but it also goes to some other hosts, including rose and currants. The larvae are going to be a flat-headed borer that will usually make kind of spiraling tunnels underneath the bark, and when it becomes full-grown, or nearly full-grown, it will girdle all the way around, causing a point of weakness that may then cause the cane to break at that point. We also see that with another kind of flat-headed borer that is common on some of the oaks we see a little to the east in Nebraska, Ohio, and the like, where it makes spiraling tunnels underneath the bark of an oak twig, and then at some point girdles all the way around the twig, and it breaks beyond that point. These are flat-headed borers. These are going to turn into some sort of small metallic wood borer. But unlike some of the other ones we will talk about later that go into the trunk, these are usually quite small. In the southern U.S., there's also an interesting group of beetles, primarily one species known as a twig girdler. And this makes a very distinctive kind of injury where the adult will go around and girdle all the way around a twig and then lay its eggs in the part of the plant that's still going to be remaining attached to the tree, the living part. The area beyond the feeding injury, though, often breaks and drops to the ground. But the larvae will be developing within the twig. Now this is a kind of a beetle larva that is in the round-headed borer family rather than the flat-headed borer family. Again, not a common one in the Rocky Mountain region, but in the southern, particularly southeastern U.S., can be quite common insect, particularly on nut trees. So controlling these kind of shoot borers, if you were to attempt it, would be the same kind of principle we have with so many of these kinds of insects that are going to be developing inside. They're exposed when the adult is on the bark. They are laying eggs on the outside of the tree. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae move into the terminal growth. So try to figure out when the period of adult activity and egg laying is occurring is the appropriate treatment timing were you to wish to manage this kind of group of insects. However, it is rare for these kinds of insects to do appreciable harm to the plant. It is more often a cosmetic kind of injury and a curiosity. Now there's one fly that needs attention that also goes into the terminal growth called rose midge. This is very erratic in terms of where it shows up. It is an insect that has been moved around, and sometimes a planting may have rose midge and another one not too far away may not have it at all. But it can be devastating to roses, particularly some of the hybrid tea roses. It is a tiny little larva, a little maggot, pale colored, that develops in the newer growth of the plant. So I don't have good pictures of the adults, but the adults are going to lay their eggs in the new growth, just underneath the little folds of the leaf, or within the developing bud, on the edges of developing buds, and then the larvae hatch from those eggs. They feed by creating small little slashing wounds. They cut the developing tissue, which often causes it to then die back. So the kind of symptoms you might see, it might be a blind shoot that fails to produce any healthy new growth. It may cause an existing shoot to die back, and it may also affect the developing flower buds as well. Often the flower buds that are affected by this will completely abort, and you won't have any flowers, which is of course the primary concern with rose growers. Sometimes if a low level of infestation is present on a developing bud, it may just be partially damaged, so it comes out kind of in a crooked, deformed manner, as indicated in the picture in the upper left. When full grown, the larvae drop to the ground, pupate in the soil, shallowly in the soil. Adults emerge about a week later and repeat the cycle. And a generation is typically completed in 2.5 to 4 weeks, so you can have multiple generations during the year. Oftentimes, peak injury is reported to show up late June into July. But this is an insect that again has multiple generations, and that causes difficulties for control. For rose midge control, there is considerable range in the response of many kinds of roses to this insect. So in some cases, people will discontinue growing certain cultivars that are highly susceptible to the insect and only grow those that are more resistant and show little injury. Regular pruning and disposal of symptomatic terminals is also recommended as a cultural control. This has to be done extremely thoroughly and regularly. The point here is you are trying to get rid of terminals that show symptoms before the insects have completed development and then drop to the ground. There are insecticides that can be sprayed to control the adults. Spinosad is used. Some of the systemic insecticides are used, the neonicotinoids. Multiple applications are required, and these can be quite effective. However, it should be noted that if we have a kind of rose where the situation is a problem, and it is one that is attractive to bees or other pollinating insects, then you have to control this insect in a way that is compatible with pollinators. You cannot be spraying plants in bloom. So that finishes up the group of insects that are feeding on the terminal growth, with one odd exception that I'm just going to be talking about next, and then the cicada situation.